Frank Sinatra's barber had been cutting his hair for 30 years without saying a word. The scissors stopped mid-cut. For the first time in 3 decades, the rhythm that had become as familiar as breathing was broken. Frank Sinatra felt the sudden stillness in the small barbershop on Mulberry Street, where he'd been coming every 2 weeks since 1945. Antonio Benedetto had never been a man of many words. In 30 years of cutting hair, shaving faces, and trimming sideburns for the most famous voice in America, he had perfected the art of invisible service. He would nod when Frank arrived, gesture silently toward the chair, and work with the precision of a master craftsman who understood that some men came not just for grooming, but for sanctuary. The barbershop was a portal to another time. Red leather chair worn smooth by decades of use, mirrors framed in mahogany that reflected stories they could never tell, and the scent of bay rum mixing with Old Spice. Here, Frank Sinatra wasn't the chairman of the board. He was simply Francesco, the skinny kid from Hoboken who'd made good, coming to see the old man who reminded him of his father. It was March 15th, 1975, a Thursday like any other. The morning light filtered through Venetian blinds, casting stripes across Antonio's weathered hands as he worked. Frank sat with his eyes closed, feeling the familiar comfort of routine. The tour dates were piling up. Vegas, London, Sydney. His voice was still strong at 60, still drawing crowds who came to hear him sing about love and loss and the passage of time. Antonio moved with the same careful precision he always had, trimming around the ears with delicate snips, shaping the hairline that had remained remarkably unchanged through decades of fame. But something was different today. His hands, usually steady as a surgeon's, trembled slightly. The scissors hesitated between cuts. Frank noticed, but said nothing. He had learned to read the silences in this small room, to appreciate the sanctuary that Antonio provided simply by being present without needing anything in return. No autographs, no photographs, no stories to tell at cocktail parties. Just service, rendered with dignity and discretion. But today, the silence felt heavier, weighted with something unspoken. Antonio set down his scissors and walked to the window, his back to the chair where Frank sat, draped in the familiar striped cape. For a long moment, neither man moved. The city hummed beyond the glass. Car horns, footsteps, the distant sound of construction. Life continuing its relentless march while time stood still in this small room. "Mr. Sinatra," Antonio said, his voice barely above a whisper. It was the first time he had addressed Frank directly in 30 years. Frank's eyes opened, meeting Antonio's reflection in the mirror. "I need to tell you something." The old barber's accent was thick with the cadence of southern Italy, words shaped by a tongue that had learned English late in life, but had mastered the language of silence much earlier. "My son," Antonio continued, his voice catching. "My boy, Giuseppe. You never knew about him." Frank turned in the chair, facing the man who had been a constant presence in his life, but whose personal story remained a mystery. "He wanted to be a singer, like you." Antonio's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Every day he would play your records. That's life, my way, fly me to the moon." He knew every word, every pause, every breath. He would stand in front of the mirror in our apartment and pretend he was on stage, holding a hairbrush like a microphone. The confession poured out like water through a broken dam, 30 years of silence breaking all at once. I told him it was foolish. I told him to learn a trade, to be practical. I said, "There is only one Frank Sinatra. There is no room for another one." I made him stop singing. I made him help me in the shop instead. Frank sat motionless, understanding that he was witnessing something sacred, a father's guilt, carried for decades, finally given voice. He died in Vietnam, January 14th, 1968. He was 22 years old. Antonio's voice was steady now, as if speaking the truth had given him strength. His last letter home, he wrote, "Papa, I still sing your favorite songs at night. The other soldiers like it when I sing Sinatra. It reminds them of home." The barbershop fell silent except for the distant sound of traffic and the ticking of an old clock on the wall. Frank felt something shift inside his chest, a recognition of grief that transcended the space between performer and audience, between famous and unknown, between the man who sang about life and the man who had lived it in quiet desperation. "Why are you telling me this?" Frank asked gently. Antonio moved closer to the chair, his hands no longer shaking. "Because every time I cut your hair, I think of my Giuseppe. I think of how I told him there was no room for dreamers. I think of how wrong I was." He paused, looking directly into Frank's eyes. "And I think of how you kept dreaming when everyone told you to stop. You kept singing when they said you were finished. You showed the world that dreams don't die just because someone says they should." Frank felt tears he hadn't expected, salt stinging his eyes as he understood the weight of 30 years of silent service, 30 years of a father's regret transferred onto the man his son had wanted to become. "I never had the chance to tell Giuseppe I was proud of him," Antonio continued. "But I can tell you, every song you sing, every stage you stand on, every dream you make real, you're singing for all the boys who never got the chance. You're living the life my Giuseppe dreamed of living." What happened next surprised even Frank himself. He stood from the chair, the cape falling to the floor, and embraced the old barber. Two men from different worlds, connected by grief and recognition, and the understanding that some truths take decades to surface. "What was his favorite song?" Frank asked. "In the wee small hours of the morning," Antonio replied without hesitation. "He said it was about hope, about believing that tomorrow could be different from today." Frank wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. The gesture was simple, human, stripped of all the polish and performance that had defined his public life for decades. "Antonio," he said, "I need you to do something for me." The old barber nodded. "I need you to close the shop for the rest of the day. I need you to come with me." 3 hours later, Frank Sinatra walked onto the stage at the Copacabana for an unscheduled appearance. The surprised audience fell silent as he approached the microphone with an elderly Italian man beside him. "Ladies and gentlemen," Frank said, his voice carrying a weight it hadn't held in years, "I want you to meet Antonio Benedetto. For 30 years he's been cutting my hair. More than that, he's been carrying a story that I needed to hear." Frank turned to Antonio, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "This song is for Giuseppe." As the orchestra began the familiar opening notes of "In the Wee Small Hours of the Morning," Frank sang not as the chairman of the board, not as Old Blue Eyes, but as a son who understood the ache of a father's love, the weight of dreams deferred, and the power of finally speaking truth. When the song ended, the audience rose to its feet, but Frank was looking only at Antonio, who was crying openly now. 30 years of silence finally broken by the sound of his son's favorite song sung by the man his boy had wanted to become. The next morning, Frank Sinatra canceled his world tour. His manager was furious. The press was baffled, but Frank simply disappeared, leaving behind a note that read, "Some things matter more than the show." For 6 months, Frank Sinatra vanished from public life. He wasn't seen at nightclubs or recording studios. He didn't appear on television or in magazines. He simply went home to his mother's recipes and his father's stories, and the quiet understanding that fame means nothing without the wisdom to know when to walk away from it. When he returned, those closest to him noticed something different. His performances had gained a new depth, a rawness that came from understanding that every song was sung not just for the audience in front of him, but for all the Giuseppe Benedettos who had hummed his melodies in foxholes and factory floors and barbershops across America. Antonio continued cutting hair until his death in 1982. On his funeral day, Frank Sinatra sang "In the Wee Small Hours of the Morning" a cappella, his voice carrying across the small church where dreams and regrets were finally laid to rest together. The barbershop on Mulberry Street closed after Antonio's passing, but the red leather chair remained, along with a small plaque that read, "In memory of Giuseppe Benedetto, who sang when no one was listening." Sometimes the most important conversations happen after 30 years of silence. Sometimes the truth arrives not in grand gestures, but in the space between scissors and skin, between service and recognition, between a father's regret and a singer's understanding that every note matters because someone, somewhere, needs to hear it. That Thursday in March, Frank Sinatra learned that he hadn't just been singing for audiences. He'd been singing for the dreamers and the discouraged, for fathers and sons, for everyone who had ever believed that tomorrow could sound different from today. The music stopped being about fame that day. It became about something deeper, the recognition that we are all connected by the songs we carry, the dreams we nurture, and the stories we finally find the courage to tell. Years later, when journalists asked Frank about those missing 6 months, he never gave them the answer they wanted. He never spoke of nervous breakdowns or creative crises or the pressures of fame. Instead, he would simply say, "I learned something important from an old friend. Sometimes you have to stop performing to remember why you started." But those who knew him best understood that something fundamental had shifted during that conversation with Antonio. Frank began visiting veterans' hospitals, not for publicity, but because he remembered Giuseppe's letter about singing Sinatra songs to homesick soldiers. He established a scholarship fund for young musicians, quietly paying for voice lessons and studio time for kids whose parents couldn't afford their dreams. On quiet Sunday mornings, Frank would sometimes drive to the small cemetery in Queens, where Giuseppe Benedetto was buried. He would sit by the headstone and hum in the wee small hours of the morning, imagining the young soldier who had once sung those same notes under foreign stars, carrying a piece of home in his voice. Antonio's nephew later found a journal among the old Barber's possessions. Page after page was filled with observations about Frank's visits, how his mood changed with the seasons, which songs made him smile when his shoulders carried the weight of the world. "He comes here not as a star," one entry read, "but as a son seeking his father's approval. I give him what I can through silence and steady hands." The final entry, dated just days before Antonio's confession, simply said, "Giuseppe would be proud. It is time to tell him." In 1985, 10 years after that transformative Thursday, Frank was performing at Carnegie Hall when he spotted an elderly woman in the front row. She looked familiar, but he couldn't place her face. During intermission, she sent a note backstage. "My name is Maria Benedetto. Antonio was my husband. Giuseppe was my son. Thank you for keeping his memory alive." Frank invited her backstage after the show, and they talked until dawn about dreams and loss and the strange ways life connects strangers through shared pain. She told him that Antonio had died peacefully, humming "My Way" in his sleep. "He said you taught him that it's never too late to speak the truth," Maria whispered. "And that silence, when it comes from love, is just another kind of song." Frank kept visiting that barbershop on Mulberry Street even after it closed, standing outside the locked door, remembering the man who had served him with dignity for 30 years, before finally trusting him with his greatest sorrow. Some gifts, he learned, arrive wrapped in silence, waiting decades to be unwrapped. When Frank Sinatra died in 1998, among his most treasured possessions was a small photograph tucked inside his wallet. A young soldier with kind eyes and his father's smile, holding a harmonica. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written, "Giuseppe Benedetto, 1946-1968. He sang when no one was listening." The truth was, someone had always been listening, and some songs, once heard, echo forever.